Part 3. The middle of the sentence. The comma.
This is a comma. If a period is the stop sign in a sentence, then a comma is a yield sign. Stop, take a breath, look for oncoming phrases, and proceed. It tells the reader where to pause and separates parts of a sentence that are in danger of colliding. They pretty much help the reader move from the beginning to the end of the sentence without getting lost along the way. Here's what a comma looks like in action.
I love punctuation. And that's the truth.
Ah, the wily comma. They can be great, but they can also be a little scary. Generally speaking, the four main uses of the comma are 1, to separate items in a list, 2, to separate introductory phrases or clauses from the rest of the sentence, 3, to isolate interrupting words or phrases, and 4, to vary the pace and tone of the sentence for style. But don't panic. If you didn't get all that, we're going to take you through comma usage nice and slow.
Section A. Separating items in a list.
One of the most common uses of the comma is to separate items in a list. When we use commas to separate things, we make it easier for the reader to see exactly what's happening in the sentence.
Hello, I'm Marla Stubing, and welcome to Arts, Crafts, and You. On today's program, we'll be making a lovely pencil cozy. First, you take an oatmeal box, like this one, and empty out all the oatmeal. Then, you paint it, let it dry, and glue on these little beads. The beads I've selected are red, yellow, and blue. See? Oatmeal to elegant in just 3 simple steps. Now you can use your pencil cozy to store all of your pencils.
Look at this. Marla used commas to separate 3 kinds of things: nouns, verb phrases, and adjectives. Let's look at one of those sentences. Then you paint it, comma, let it dry, comma, and glue on these little beads. That makes the sentence a lot easier to read.
If you look closely, you'll see that the commas are really just standing in for the word and. The commas separate 3 verb phrases: paint it, and let it dry, and glue on these little beads, making the sentence easier to read. Take a look at the sentence without commas, and now with commas. Without, with. See the difference? It's easier to spot the items in the list when we use commas to break things up. Aren't commas great?
Let's take a look at another sentence. The beads Marla used are red, comma, yellow, comma, and blue. The commas are breaking up a list of adjectives, in this case, a bunch of colors.
There's one time we don't use commas to separate items in a list, and that's when we're listing a bunch of adjectives that each belong to a different category and are all positioned right before their noun. Don't panic. We'll show you exactly what we mean. First, we'll talk about category, then position. We wrote,
the beads Marla used are red, yellow, and blue, and we use commas. Notice that red, yellow, and blue all belong to the same category. They're all colors. But what if we had big green square beads? The words big, green, and square are all adjectives, but they belong to different categories. Big is a size, green is a color, and square is a shape. And size, color, and shape are all different categories.
Now that we're dealing with adjectives in different categories, let's talk about position. There are 2 ways we can write our sentence. We could write,
The beads Marla used are big, green, and square. Or Marla used big green square beads. In the first sentence, the adjectives come after the noun beads, but in the second sentence, the adjectives come right before it. And you remember what we said.
remember, there's one time we don't use commas to separate items in a list, and that's when we're listing a bunch of adjectives that each belong to a different category, and they're all positioned right before their noun.
okay, so if we write Marla used red, yellow, and blue beads, since red, yellow, and blue belong to the same category, we use commas. If we write the beads Marla used are big, green, and square, the adjectives big, green, and square don't come right before their noun, beads. So again, we use commas. Now, what if we write Marla used big, green, square beads? Aha! Our adjectives big, green, and square are all different categories, and they come right in front of their noun, beads. Since the adjectives in this sentence meet both criteria, guess what? No commas.
So that's our one exception to using commas in lists. When we're listing a bunch of adjectives that each belong to a different category, and they're all positioned right before their noun. Remember when we talked about how commas make things easier for the reader by breaking things up visually? We saw how that worked when we use commas to separate items in a list. Now let's look at how we can use commas the same way to break up larger parts of a sentence.
As we go through the other uses of the comma, we're going to mention places where using a comma isn't really right or wrong, but might be necessary to prevent a misreading. In these cases, it's up to you, the writer, to decide whether or not you want to use a comma. And don't panic. We'll be there to let you know loud and clear when you must use a comma and when it's optional. When you see this, you'll know.